All right, it looks like Bex has joined us. Hello, Bex. And we are at 4:04, so I guess we can get started here. My apologies in advance. This is going to be something of an emotional day. So if I get choked up in places, that's just how important Dave was to me. So please understand.
I'll be all right.
All right. So you should see my screen.
Yep.
All right. I was going to give a tribute to Dave today, and I am, but middle of last week, I learned that we'd lost Barry Longyear. And in fact, we lost him on the very first day that I was doing these jazz sessions. He passed away in a hospital in Maine, and I didn't know that. Barry was, let's see, that would be 83. Just a second, Sherry is joining us. Barry was 83. Today, he is mostly forgotten, unless you're old like me. If you know him at all, you most likely know him for Enemy Mine, which got turned into a movie. Um, I no longer have to give the warning I used to give, which is if you like the movie, please don't tell Barry because he hated it. They took his wonderful, philosophical, thought provoking, human, emotional story and cut off his ending and put a Hollywood action ending on the end. Up until then, it was Barry's story and it was good. And then it's like, but Hollywood isn't going to end on a long philosophical exploration of the bigotry across cultures. They're going to have a fight scene. And it's a fight scene about bigotry, but Hollywood needed that action ending. Well, you can enjoy the movie without guilt now because Barry's not around to say how much he hated it. The good news is, in the last year of his life, was in negotiation with Disney to make a revised movie and not just Enemy Mine, but the entire Enemy Papers, which is a long combination of three books in the same universe. And it may be one of the best books I have ever read. The ending of the Enemy Papers is an absolute gut punch, especially if you loved Enemy Mine. When you get to the end of the Enemy Papers, you're going to feel like you've been punched. It is just absolutely phenomenal and sadly still very relevant today. He also, same universe, had his Circus World stories, which were stories about a interstellar circus, and the first ex- publication order, the first ones were about a person stranded there trying to make a treaty with this bunch of circus descendants who had their own very unique society, where the first thing they did when they finally started to put together a government was to put together the law for making laws. And they made it so complicated that no one could possibly ever make a second law. And this ambassador has to make a treaty with them, which would be a second law. And it proceeds to tell the whole story of this. And then he went back and wrote the prequels of how this world came to be, how they became a star traveling circus, and how they got stranded and everything. Circus World is a lot of fun with choice, meaty philosophy behind it. One of his short stories, The House of If, may be one of the best stories I've ever read. It is very close, excuse me, to Enemy Mine in that regard. We have Dawn Ray in the waiting room. So Dawn Ray is joining us. So House of If is one of the best stories I've ever read. It is about a gentleman who gets falsely accused of a crime, falsely imprisoned, and finally gets his release and then proceeds to become an advocate for prison reform because he feels like the whole process was entirely off base, and he gets put into a prison that he had never imagined before, and he becomes something he'd never imagined before. The War Whisperer, which I'm still in the middle of, was Barry's last series, his magnum opus, that he more or less was in a mood of, please let me finish this before I die, and he did. Barry was very open about why he disappeared from the writing world and why people today have barely heard of him, even though with Enemy Mine, he won literally the Hugo, Nebula, and John W. Campbell Award all in the same year. And if you're familiar with the old John W. Campbell Award, it's only for writers in their first 2 years. So he won the Triple Crown inside of 2 years from his first published story. And the night he won the last of those prizes, he was sitting in his hotel room wondering if this was the night he was going to kill himself to put an end to it all because it was so empty and meaningless. Barry became very open eventually about the fact that he was addicted to narcotics, alcohol. He was a addict in recovery for basically since the 80s on. And he was an advocate for recovery programs. He was a helping hand reaching out to anybody with trouble. A lot of that is captured in the book St. Mary Blue. If you are curious of what life is like for people going through recovery who are what they call the hard cases, because they are the smart ones. Smart ones know how to play the game so that all the counselors think that everything's going just fine, and the smart ones are really just doing what they want and mouthing the words. St. Mary Blue is the story of a bunch of addicts in a treatment center in Minnesota, a real treatment center, and how they are all coping with their addiction. It is about a writer who is in this clinic. It is not Barry, it is just Barry's story. But he fictionalized it enough, so call it fiction. So, I am talking about Dave this week, but I had to talk about Barry. Sorry, because he would have been, I would say, my first writing mentor. He was the first writer I ever saw start out. And watching Barry made me realize that writers start out. The writers send in stories and cross their fingers and hope. And that writers aren't all born these people on the Olympus heights. They aren't all these bestsellers that just were always there, that you start out. And Barry showed me that that was possible. In later years, after he'd gone through the recovery, he became a very different writer, a very different philosopher of writing, that he felt like part of what, and by no means all, he didn't blame this, but it fed into his addiction. Part of what made his addiction so horrible was the external pressure and stress that he had to be success. He had to make all this money. He had to make all these deals. He had to meet these deadlines. He had to. And that just all fed into his addictive personality. Post recovery, Barry went back to a very valuable lesson, which I think some of us can use sometimes. He started writing because it mattered to him. And in the beginning, he wrote what mattered to him. And as all these pressures mounted and as he got more success, he wrote what mattered to the people who were paying the money or giving him the fan awards or all of these pressures. And he went back to say, okay, you need to write what matters to you. And he wrote a very, very powerful book on this called The Right Stuff, Write. And that was before he really got deep into this, but it was about identifying what matters to you. And that's what you should be writing. And so he would sometimes chew me out. I only ever had the chance to meet him once in person, but I met him a lot online. And he would sometimes chew me out because I was fretting over deadlines and fretting over, would the readers like this? And fretting over, will any editor care? And his answer was always, do you like it? Because that's the reason I did start writing originally. And I still try to make it my reason today is first, I have to make myself happy. So I wanted to remember Barry because the loss is still so fresh. And now I'm going to choke up all over again because we're going to talk about Dave. So today's session, tribute to Dave Wolverton. Some of you here had the chance to meet him and study under him like I did. So thank you for joining us. So Dave, come in. We lost him in January 2022. Wrote under Dave Wolverton as his real name, but also under David Farland as his pen name. He generally did the fantasy as Farland and the science fiction as Wolverton. He was a best-selling author, known today largely for his Rune Lord series. He was also the author of perhaps one of the top Star Wars books out there, The Courtship of Princess Leia. Of course, not canon anymore, thank you very much, Disney, but I think it's still one of the top selling Star Wars books out there. Over 50 novels in total, of which 40s were bestsellers. And then he wrote lots of short stories, and he wrote novellas and essays, and we'll be talking about some of those coming up. Uh, Please, as always, if you have comments to make, jump in, especially those of you who knew Dave. I knew him primarily through Writers of the Future, and I'm so grateful to this contest for a lot of reasons. Dave's at the top of the list. He was the grand prize winner in 1987. 4 years later, he became a judge. And then eventually, he became the coordinating judge, taking over from Algis Budrys from volume 8 till volume 14. And at volume 14, he basically told them, this is wonderful. I'm glad I could help, but my own career needs some attention. And they said, okay, we understand, Dave. I guess don't know the history entirely, but Algis took it back up for a little while. And then Katie Wentworth took it up from there and did a wonderful job of shepherding the contest right up until she passed away of cancer. She was literally still judging entries in her hospital bed at the end. So in volume 29, I'm sorry, in volume 29, when she was gone, Dave volunteered to pick it back up for a year so they'd have a time to find a real judge to carry forward because they needed him and because the contest mattered to him that much. And he stuck with it until he passed away. That's how much it mattered to him to nurture young writers and new writers. Because he was always a teacher at Writers of the Future. He taught the workshop every year, generally with Tim Powers. He taught at Brigham Young from 1999 to 2002. You'll sometimes hear people talk about the 318R course. That was the name of the course that he taught at BYU. And as you can tell from 318, it's a more advanced course. Two of his most successful students were Brandon Sanderson, who is one of the most stellar phenoms in the fantasy world today. Had the largest Kickstarter forever when he had his last Kickstarter campaign, $42 million raised. Brandon also then took over Dave's 318R class for a while. I'm not sure if he's still teaching it or not, but you can find Brandon's lectures from that class free on YouTube all over the place. So there's Dave's legacy continuing on. He also taught Stephanie Meyer, the author of Twilight, and helped advise her on what sort of writing would best suit her, where she would find her best work, and therefore her best audience. And it kind of took off more than I think even Dave could have predicted. He also taught at Superstars Writing Seminar. In fact, he was one of the founders. Superstars, for those who haven't attended it, is an annual conference in Colorado Springs in February, because it's cheaper to go there in February. Um, Founded by Dave, Kevin J. Anderson, Rebecca Mesta. I think Eric Flint was part of that original group. Still going on today. It is primarily about the business of writing. And these days, it's especially about the indie business of writing. It is about how to control your career. They also have a day on craft, but it is largely about how to control your career, make your decisions about your writing career. It's relatively affordable. I think it's in the 600 range. I haven't checked recently, but it's every year. And it is also a great networking opportunity because Dave and these instructors built a tribe, that these are people who support each other. Obviously, no place is perfect. There's jerks everywhere. But Superstars is an incredibly supportive community. Uh, Dave also taught at conventions and conferences. We have Dawn, Ray, and Jenna joining us from FireCon, and Dave regularly taught at FireCon, and taught some of his richest material there. And he was constantly trying to reach out to people and reach out to writers and get them the information they needed to go forward. I remember one time back when FireCon was in person before the world went crazy and we all had to stay in our homes. So we were out in Utah and I was sitting in the lobby area talking to a young friend who'd showed up just to visit me because her dad and I go back way back. And the two of them had showed up and I was talking about a writing lesson I had learned from Dave. I forget which one it was. And Dave happened to be walking by at that instant, and I said, "Oh, hey, there's Dave. He can explain it better than I can." And Dave sat there and talked to my young friend for an hour and a half because she mattered to him. He's also taught these workshops traveling on the road, different cities. He published for a long time daily writing tips, a short essay on writing, and we'll come back to those. We'll see some of these in action. He has a website, mystorydoctor.com, which collects a lot of information on his teaching and his work. He also, in the last couple of years of his life, decided that there could be a supportive writing community, that there was all the potential out there for an online writing community. And he put together the Apex Writer. It started with Dave teaching lessons, but slowly he worked in guest instructors, and week by week there would be different meetings on different topics. It is still going on today. It's not the same without Dave, but nothing is. But it is still a very supportive community. Some of his other students, Brandon Mull from the Fablehaven series, Eric James Flint, who sadly we've also lost, but from the 1632 and several other things. And I want to call out Carrie English as one of his students, not just because she's a dear friend, but because Dave and Dave's family valued her so much as one of his students that they asked her to finish the job he had started on writing the last Rune Lord's book. I am not allowed to say what I know about progress on that, but keep your eyes open. That book is coming. He was also definitely, first and foremost, a family man. He married Mary in 1985. They had two daughters and three sons, of whom he was very proud, and more grandchildren than I can count. And official sources don't say what the number is, but he loved time with his grandchildren. Other families, interesting. They're not my stories to tell, but Dave would tell stories about his father and his grandfather. And Dave grew up in interesting circumstances. And the fact that Dave came out such a good and gentle man after that is a tribute to his character. He also talked about good lessons he learned from them, but there were a lot of things that Dave taught me the attitude that it's all research. anything you go through in life can become grist for the mill in your stories. And Dave had some grist. And that wasn't the only grist. He had a very wide ranging life. Originally, he was going to school for pre med because he saw the career potential there and he had the fascination with medical stuff and everything. But in school, he just could not stop studying the writing. And he started saying, "This is my calling." But then along the way, he also spent some time as a prison guard because you got to pay the bills. And he got interesting story potential out of that as well. Because Dave studied. I think he may have been one of the most intentional students that I ever knew. Times and time after time, I would hear him talking about stuff he was out there studying just because it fascinated him. And if he was fascinated, it might turn it up in a story today, but it also just made him more informed about the world around him. It made him, it fed his vast curiosity. He also traveled. Some of that was purely for the broadening education that you get out of travel time with family, but often he was also traveling for a reason of, I want to experience this environment because I need it in a story. All of this was part of what made his story engine work. And Dave had a lot of books that came out of this, not for fiction, but for us, for how we can be writers. And these are the top ones I find in the series. He may have some others that I missed, but these were the ones I could dig out. And first and foremost of those would be Million Dollar Outlines. This is a marketing page from the new Legacy edition of Million Dollar Outlines. And so this is what they're going to promise you. And I'll give you the marketing talk here because this is what they're trying to do to promote. And then I'll talk about it personally. So, how to craft a best-selling story with million-dollar potential, and how to take that idea and make it into a publishable form. If you're ready to make that, this is the book for you. Now, that's all marketing speak. We all know that marketing speak is full of great, brilliant, glowing generalities. Let's talk about specifics. He talks in here about the psychology of what makes someone read, what we look for in story. He talks about the actual, because remember, pre-med, he studied all of this from the inside. He talks about the actual physiological reactions and what we experience vicariously through stories and how that feeds into our neurophysiology. He talks about how this varies across different audiences. He talks about the shape of the general outline of Western fiction and how you can be writing to it or sometimes going against it, coming up with different ways of doing it, but why you're doing it intentionally. He talks about specific ways of outlining. And this is, of all the Dave books I own, this is the one I hear recommended the most often. And so I don't normally do a sales pitch, but I'm going to give you a sales pitch here on this one. The family has got a new legacy edition of Million Dollar Outlines. So that's at mdolegacybook.com/legacy edition. It's the legacy edition. It is available both as the ebook and also the audiobook all together, and 3 free bonus lessons, video lessons, all for $4.99. This is a steal. I paid more than that for just the ebook when it came out way back when, and it was worth it and more than that. So this is the Legacy Edition, and when you sign up, they will also offer to let you join Apex for $1 for I think it's the first year. So I don't normally say go buy this, but this one I'm saying take a look. Look at the page, decide for yourself. I think the page is, like I said, full of marketing speak, full of generalities. But let me tell you, writer to writer, this is a book I drew on heavily, both in my own career and then when I was creating my book, Making Story Models. A lot of it built on lessons from Dave and carried it in a new direction. I don't want to jump too much into my own book, but there was a point where I said to Dave at Writers of the Future, I think this is wrong. And he said, well, that's the way it's always been done. In my book, I showed why it's wrong and how to do it better and taught that as lessons for Dave's Apex group. And Dave encouraged me to turn that into a book. So, Million Dollar Outlines is a book I highly recommend. Now let's look at some of our others. So, Write That Novel. Now, a number of the books that Dave produced, remember I talked about his daily kicks, the tips he would produce every day? A number of the books Dave produced were gathering the tips that were relevant to one particular topic and reorganizing them and connecting them together into one coherent book on one topic. And that's what this was. This was dozens of articles from his daily tips on the specific subject of how to structure a novel and how to fit it to audience analysis. So it's got some overlap with the Making Story Models, but it's in the form of short essays so you can read a topic, think about it, maybe go apply it, and then move on to the next one. Daily Meditations also derives from his daily tips, where he basically wanted to write or gather together the tips he had written that were ways to think about you and about your writing, encourage you, get you thinking deeper, and turn those into little inspirational lessons. So many of us got to read a bunch of these for free long before he gathered them in books, but that was long ago when he was publishing them on every day. Now you can gather them here in this book. And then we get to Writing Wonder, which is not a daily tips collection. And this is, I would say, the second or third most common book that I recommend from Dave. This one and Resonance. I go back and forth which one I recommend after the Million Dollar Outlines. It kind of depends on which book I think you need. Writing Wonder is Dave's approach to fantasy and science fiction literature, which he called collectively wonder literature. He felt that the divide between them was arbitrary, that they were both about inspiring wonder in the audience, and he felt that if you put both of those two together, you got a massive category as opposed to splitting them off into two smaller categories. He felt like the goals of wonder were the same, whether it was fantasy or science fiction. There were different methods along the way, but they're about the strange, the exciting, the new. And he felt like it was a highly underserved topic, which is ironic because, as other writers have pointed out, the history of literature is more wonder literature than anything else. All the Greek myths, most of the Greek poems or Greek plays, um, everything from so long was what we would today consider fantasy or science fiction. And yet people will look down at it as that's not serious literature. Like, oh, really? Homer isn't serious? Dante isn't serious? Uh, Mary Shelley isn't serious? And there are a lot of writers who have written on that topic of essentially defending wonder literature. Dave wrote a book on how to do the wonder literature, how to gather the attention, and how to build the elements that make readers go, oh, wow. I love this book. I wish Dave had had a chance to do a science fiction version of this book because this is, although it's about science fiction and fantasy, the examples are probably 90% fantasy, and I'd love to see this book done with examples from science fiction. But regardless, it's a book I recommend highly. This one, Blockbuster Book Signings, is ideas for how to do successful book signings. Now, if you aren't at the point where you have books to sign yet, this doesn't help you so much, but maybe you could be planning ahead. If you have books to sign, this is ways to do more successful book signings. Dave, for a while, I don't know if he still does, but Dave, for a while, held the Guinness record for the largest book signing ever. But in this book, it's not about necessarily the largest, it's about effective book signings. So, ways to find different places to do signings. One of his favorite ones he talked about is if you're a YA author or middle grade author, you can have signings at schools if you know how to make the connections and how to promote. And kids at schools don't necessarily have money, but parents and librarians do. Um, Simple thing. Another one he talked about was no chocolate. Especially no, and he uses an example is no ice cream sundaes. A book signing, they had ice cream sundaes as a gimmick. And all of a sudden, the store has got a huge chunk of their merchandise is ruined. They can't return the books, they can't sell the books because they're full of chocolate syrup. So, a good book when you're ready to be signing, be reading this book. Now, NaNoWriMo has kind of fallen in disrepute because some of the behaviors of the people behind it. Ignore the people behind it. NaNoWriMo is simply a challenge that you're going to try to write a book, a complete novel, in a month. And people have done it successfully, many people. This was a book that Dave took some of his tips and turned them into here are ideas to help you in that 30-day period. A little essay for each day that you could read and see how it applied. So it's another set of his tips specifically focused on progress, on keeping going through that month of don't slow down, don't look back, get the job done. And finally, the other book that I recommend highly from Dave. And I think this is probably my second favorite, sometimes more my first, because some of the lessons in it I kind of need to remind myself once in a while. The concept of resonance is that your stories can be like stories that came before and should be. He talks about how it's unavoidable that you will draw upon the influences that made you who you are and include them. And if you do it right, you create a more receptive audience. So often we get people worried about my work isn't original. My work is just blah, 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 blah. It's like, okay, first of all, I understand why you're saying that because no one wants a carbon copy of something that came before. But the likelihood that you're going to just do a carbon copy gets really small as you write more. You will put more and more of yourself into it, but you're also putting all the things that came before. And as an example, he analyzes Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's work, and shows how Tolkien drew from his influences to create one of the best selling series of all time. So apparently, not being original didn't slow Tolkien down. I need to remind myself of this sometimes because sometimes I look and say, well, isn't this just like, and sometimes it's like, well, if I'm exactly copying, that's bad. But if it has elements that are similar, that's my influences coming out and it will make people care. And this for me was, in fact, a very, very personal lesson to learn. My book, Today I Am Carrie, unavoidably has comparisons to Asimov's robot books, to Data from Star Trek, although I think that one's a weaker one. People who are familiar with Data, that's what they mention when they read my book sometimes. Most of all, the original short story it was based on, Today I Am Paul, is a strongly influenced book, strongly influenced by Flowers for Algernon, one of the most famous book or short stories novellas. I think it was a novelette in science fiction history, later turned into a novel, which for me was weaker. But in fact, when I wrote Today I'm Carrie, part of what went into that was, besides the fact that Flowers for Algernon influenced my original story, I also had to look at how did Daniel Keyes, I think, how did Keyes turn his short story into a novel? And I looked at how he did it, and I felt he failed. I mean, it's an okay novel. It lacks the punch of the original story. And I went out and polled readers to say, okay, have you read both? How do you feel about the two side by side? And then I looked and said, okay, I see what he did. And I'll give you the short answer, not the long analysis. Keyes had a brilliant time boxed short story that happened within a small window of time. If you haven't read it, go read it now. Ignore me, go read it now. About a learning challenged man, very severely mentally disabled, who volunteers for a project which will cause his IQ to rise. Ultimately, it triples. And then the tragic ending comes along and it's over. And it's one of the saddest things you'll ever read. And at the same time, it's inspiring, even if there's inspiration in futility. And Keyes took that and turned it into that. For those of you who can't see, because my hands are off the camera, my hands are about 4 feet apart. He turned it into the same story with a lot of stuff in the middle. And I felt like the lot of stuff in the middle didn't contribute. It lost the punch. That short original story had so much punch. And the longer it got stretched out, the less punch it had. And so when I was looking at Today I'm Paul, which was 5,000 words, and trying to turn it into 100,000 words, I had the possibility to do what Keyes did. And I said, no, I can't do that because I felt like it destroyed Keyes's book. Sorry, but I did. So then I had two choices. I could write the story leading up to it or the story that followed it. And I looked at the leading up to it and I felt like it was going to be long and depressing. And I looked at what followed it and said, that could be really, really deep. And I wrote that. But I had to look at the resonance to say, here's what Keyes did right and what I didn't think worked. All right. So those are Dave's books on writing. You'll also find more at My Story Doctor. You'll find individual essays there. And at Apex, you'll find people who are carrying on in the path that he laid out for trying to continue the education of writers supporting writers. I want to talk about, and I kind of mentioned these in the books, but I want to talk about specifically some of my favorite Dave's lessons. Let's start with the last one because we were just there. Resonance. The idea that you have the things you love that make you love stories, and how that is something you can then build upon, because resonance is cheating. It's a shortcut. When Tolkien wrote about dwarves, he was writing about dwarves in a culture where, and we don't see this as much in America, but if you grew up in a world of British and European folklore, the dwarves are part of the background of many stories. When he wrote about wizards, he was writing in a background, in a culture where Odin and Merlin were all part of the fabric of the folklore. When I am writing about the android Carrie, I am in a world where people are familiar with Bicentennial Man by Asimov. They are familiar with Data. They are primed for this. It's kind of like a shortcut that I don't have to explain so much of this. Now, I can explain more in a longer work, but I don't have to explain everything. Some of it I can just take for granted that people understand this concept. And this is kind of a tricky thing to learn when you're a writer, that you think you need to explain everything. And sometimes you don't need to explain so much. When I sold my first story to Analog Magazine, story called Not Close Enough, about a bunch of astronauts from multiple countries on a mission to not land on Mars. Their mission was to go to Mars orbit and take lots of photographs and measurements to prepare for future Mars landings. And I won't spoil my story with what happens from there, but you can kind of guess what's likely to happen because it's a story. People have goals and they have conflicts. But when I sent that to Analog, I got a letter back from Stan Schmidt, which said essentially, there is a very good story here and Not Close Enough, but it takes too long to get there. If you were to cut off a couple thousand words, I would be happy to take a look at it again. I didn't know that this was a test, but it was. It was Stan seeing if I could take editing and follow directions. But I looked and said, I need to cut. I mean, getting a chance to resubmit is a rare invitation. So I had to do this. I'm looking and saying, but I have to explain all this. I have to explain what it's like to be in orbit around Mars in free fall. I have to explain what it's like to be dealing with airlocks and dealing with pressure and dealing with and dealing. And it's like, and I at some point stopped and said, all these things that I've known since I was 10 years old or younger, even because I was such a fan of all of this stuff, I stopped and realized I'm sending this to Analog. Analog readers pretty much know all this stuff too. I don't have to explain what free fall is. I just have to put the story in free fall and describe things. And the resonance of all of the writing they've done before, or all of the reading they've done before in free fall stories, in hard science fiction stories, they will pick it up. I hadn't studied Dave then. I didn't know the term resonance, but that was essentially what I was saying is I am writing a story in a tradition that analog readers will already know. I don't have to teach that tradition. And I cut that out and I sent it off back to Stan. And at Worldcon that year, he formally purchased the story from me at lunch. He took me to lunch for this. And I asked him, A, was this a test? And he said, yes. And B, this is what I did. And he said, that's exactly right. It was exactly what the story needed because analog readers already know this. They have a resonance with freefall hard science fiction stories. So I made that an acceptable story for that market because I relied on resonance to tell part of the story. Now, that also says that if I'd sent the same thing into, I don't know, Harper's Bazaar, is there still a Harper's Bazaar? If I'd sent it up into some general fiction magazine, I might have actually had to explain those things because it's a different audience with different resonance. When I read Dave's book on resonance, a lot of this stuff that I'd run into along the way started clicking into place. Then back to the start, audience analysis. And I talked about this a little bit when we talked about $1 Million Outlines. Dave spent time working for Hollywood studios in the greenlighting department where they would take story ideas that came in and look at how different stories appeal to different audiences. And part of this was an interesting set of studies on how different audiences behaved and recognizing and acknowledging every person is different. Any one common general behavior will be wrong, particularly because most of us here, I think, have a connection to science fiction or fantasy, and we read that. And general audience analysis says that interest in that drops off as people get older. And it ain't dropped off for me. So everybody's different, but in his discussion of audience analysis, he talks about how at a young age, that wonder literature, that new, fascinating, amazing stuff is what has the biggest draw. As we start to get into adolescence, some of that starts changing, that for the male audience, it starts becoming more about action, adventure, and sex. And for the female audience, it starts becoming more about society and social interactions and romance. And then as the age further, you see these different tendencies as the both sexes get into their middle age and later. There starts being a more interest in mystery, in the undiscovered. And Dave again in the book tells it better than I can. But the important part was that there are these broad changes that if you are trying to appeal to the wrong age group, you may be particularly limiting your audience. So it's saying that, for instance, for young kids, mystery is, I mean, okay, I love Scooby Doo, but mystery is Scooby Doo. Scooby Doo is not particularly deep mystery. And Scooby Doo is more about the hijinks and the mysterious things going on and such. It's not about, okay, how do we gather these clues and put together a case to nail this particular person who we know is the murderer, but we can't prove it. So sometimes you need to figure out who your audience is and be writing to aim for that. Going back to Barry, he would say, no, you need to be writing what matters to you. Barry and Dave are coming at this in somewhat different points of view because was all about writing what was important to you and figuring out what that was. Dave is talking practically about how to hit particular audiences. And related to that specifically was what sometimes in Hollywood they would call the four quadrants analysis. And this is what Hollywood tends to look for if they're looking for a big blockbuster. The four quadrants are old male, old female, young female. If you've got something that appeals to each of those, you've got a much broader audience than if you've only got something that appeals to one. And he talks about specifically this in relationship to the Harry Potter series, how you notice how it opens with 3 out of those represented. The very first chapter, when Hagrid is bringing Harry and Professor McGonagall and Dumbledore are waiting. So you've got McGonagall is the old male, McGonagall is the old female, and Hagrid is the young male. So 3 out of 4 quadrants are represented in there. And Dave even talked about how sometimes your audience isn't your audience. When he specifically mentioned this a couple of times in regards to the Harry Potter series, that she wanted kids to love the books, but kids don't have the money to buy books. Parents and teachers and librarians buy books. So part of the audience analysis was for that age group, you need to have something that will pass muster with the adults who are making the purchasing decisions. And so 2 of the 4 quadrants are those adults, and how putting in characters from those perspectives gave a broader appeal. All right. Talk about the schedule, but first I want to open the floor. If you have questions about Dave, or particularly for some of you, if you have remembrances about Dave you want to share, please tell people why Dave mattered to your writing career. I know it's hard. Nobody?
Hey, JT here. I'm relatively new to the a lot of the fiction authors, so I first came across Dave and Tim and pretty much the Writers of the Future game in the workshop. And
Mhm.
while I had a lot of things to take away, I just really enjoyed the workshop, and I walked away with uh, a lot more things that I had going in, a lot more things considering. I've recently went back since then multiple times to go back through the different lessons and watch the different videos, and it seems like each time I've taken away a little something more. So they continue to. It's kind of a gift that keeps on giving, and I kind of wish more people knew about it and would go see that for themselves.
You know, it looks like Dawn Ray had things to say, which doesn't surprise me. But her microphone, she said, wasn't working. Is it working now? Okay. It's sad because Dawn Ray knew Dave longer and better than I did, and I think she would have things to contribute, but her microphone is not working, um, sadly. Um, and Jenna also worked with Dave often on FireCon. I don't know if she has anything to contribute. Um, but I will basically say my career is what it is in large part because of Dave Wolverton. I want to make two very personal remembrances. And I'm sorry, these are going to sound conceited as hell, but they mattered to me in terms of keeping me going as a writer. Uh, Carrie English, I mentioned, was one of Dave's frequent students, very, very, very much an advocate of his work. And she was at one of his classes one year, and the results had just come out from Writers of the Future for that quarter. I hadn't won, which, okay, it happens. But somehow they got talking, and Dave told Carrie that he thought I had the potential to be one of the best science fiction writers out there. And knowing that he believed in me mattered a lot. And then the year after I was a winner at Writers of the Future, they asked a couple of us back to talk about marketing because we were the first volume to be a bestseller. So I wanted us to help talk to the next class about the marketing process. And as we were going through the signing line, and Dave asked a question about what was going on in my writing, and I said, "Well, okay, I just had some really great luck with a story today. I am Paul, in fact, and so I'm really kind of riding high right now. I know this happens that sometimes you have ups and sometimes you have downs, and it just happens that way. And I shouldn't take this for granted." And Dave said, "No, there's no reason for you to have downs. Just keep writing like this. You're not going to have downs if you can keep up on this." And that was another time that Dave lifted me up and encouraged me to keep going. And he did so many other times as well. But those were two times when I really needed it, and he was there for me. So, anyone else? All right. It looks like
Yeah, I had
Kimberly.
something to say, Martin.
All
Can you
right.
hear me?
Yep.
Gosh, I knew Dave probably since I want to say 2012, maybe earlier. I took one of his classes, but he was the first one that actually made me feel like writing could be a career. And he was always so wonderful. And this is the magic of Dave. If you met him, you felt like you mattered. And he would take time with you, encourage you, look at your work and point out the good, give some advice. But he was always so pleased to see me at any conference or anyone time he was selling books. I could go over him and feel like I had a friend there with him. And it was really a hard loss to have him go and be gone because the writing community, I don't think, has recovered. He was always so generous to other writers and his fans, and just such a great man. And I'm really glad you're doing this because I haven't had a chance to face this because it's been hard.
I hear you. Thank you.
Martin, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So I'm on Jenna's computer now, and I'm basically channeling my inner Kathleen Turner this weekend because I haven't had a voice for a couple days. So bear with me, guys. Uh, it's funny that Bex mentions that class because that's actually where I met Bex the first time, and Carrie English and Joss Esso, and I actually need to check that roster from that class because I'm pretty sure there's some other names in there that have become pretty big in our writing community. But I think that's one of the magical things about Dave is he really was generous to the writing world and formed communities in a way that other people don't necessarily do as well. And he was incredibly generous to people. And I think sometimes we lose a little bit of sight of that because writing's a tough business. and it takes a lot of work. And it always amazed me because, Dave did a lot of big books. He did the Rune Lords, the Star Wars books. He did video games. There's a lot of things that I didn't actually even know about until the last couple of years of his life. But through all of that, he gave his time. And what a lot of people don't realize is writing conferences run on budgets. And so do fan conventions and stuff. Dave paid his own way and his own hotel a lot of times. Because he wanted the resources to go to new writers. And I think that's the kind of generosity we need in order to bring up new writers, is that paying it forward thing that him and Mike Resnick and so many other people talked about. And I really miss Dave.
Yeah.
I miss just him being at a conference and suddenly there's a table of us talking about writing, or going to dinner with Dave and talking about how to make the community better, and Dave talking about reading all the stories for writers of the future and going, found one that surprised me. And I miss that. And I think the rest of us miss that too.
Yep. And thank you for that. All right. So if you haven't read Dave, go read Dave. Read his books on writing. Read his books on fiction. And we have a comment from Sherry. Thank you. Newer writer here. Never met Dave, but I can see his echoes in all of you. Absolutely. And thank you. That is part of the reason I'm here, is because it's what Dave would do. And I'm trying to do my part to take that little bit of legacy in me and spread it out. All right. So the upcoming schedule. Next week, we're talking about things that aren't writer's block, things we call writer's block but aren't, because if we know what they really are, then there might be things we can do about them. We'll talk after that. On the 22nd, I'll be talking about dictation. Based on my book with Kevin J. Anderson and Greg Vos, we'll be talking about how dictation can be a viable storytelling mechanism. 29th, ruthless consistency. This is particularly for the pantsers, but I think it applies to plotters too. Doing your world building on kind of an as-needed basis instead of planning way up front. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, Dave believed in planning your world in meticulous detail before you write a word. So, different approach there. Barry Longyear believed in planning your world so well that you could walk around it in the dark and find the light switch in your world. Again, not my approach. I appreciate what they wrote on it, not my approach. July 6th, we're talking about story lengths in different genres because they are not uniform. 13th, we'll be talking about the goal game, a way of asking questions to figure out what your story's about. July 20th, we're talking about frame stories and other nonlinear narratives, which apparently I'm really fond of. I didn't realize it until I started teaching this class. This one was actually one I wrote for FireCon originally, How I Met Your Story. And in the process of writing that, I realized just how many stories I grew up loving are actually nonlinear. The 27th, we'll be talking about 4 levels of learning, which I call Dwarves in the Woods. I kind of talked about this in other topics, in other talks, but this will be the time I present it completely. It may be a shorter one. The ideas may be simple enough that this one will end up being less than the full hour. August 3rd will be our next tribute. This one to Dean Wesley Smith, another hugely influential mentor of mine. August 10th, we'll be talking about distance and scope in space. Long way down to the chemist shop if you're a Douglas Adams fan. And August 17th, we'll be talking about improv and how improv can help with lessons from improv you can apply to writing in general. So, amen. Any last questions? All right. And thank you for joining me. Um, I hope this little bit of Dave wisdom here inspires you to go out and pick up lots more. Thank you.